Good morning and welcome halfway through the session on behalf of Oxfam India and all our partners in this. This is indeed to me a very significant day because I've had some involvement with the early stages of the business responsibility report when it was first being thought of, and most recently as a member of the so-called high-level committee on CSR. And therefore I see this as a progression about moving towards something that's desirable. Many people, me in particular, especially given my age, get very impatient with the speed at which we are moving. But to me, it seems that the direction is fine, and that's what I want to speak about today. Just a few comments on where we are and what we might do as we go ahead, particularly how we might help to move things quicker, faster, and make them more effective. So a brief disjointed points in three broad buckets. I want to speak first briefly about the context, and then a little bit about what we might want to do in relation to that in terms of the correctives that have been put in place and are being put in place, and finally the cooperation that may be required there. Now, part of the context, I think Nisha in her opening address mentioned a number of statistics which are all very frightening. She did it very quickly, but I know that the audience here is very familiar with them. Among the many striking ones that were mentioned were something which really hits us particularly hard. I think the fact that in India 1% of the people own 53% of the wealth, and the fact in contradiction to that, in contradistinction, is the fact that we are supposedly a socialist republic as laid out in our constitution. So you begin to see that words say one thing but actions take us in a different direction, and therefore we clearly need to look at the context. Another part of the context, again, and Nisha gave you hard figures on that, is very interesting because the same issue of mint, which carries a lot of coverage of what was presented here, which really I think is very revealing, also has a few pages later, and I'm sure many of you saw that, a very interesting comparison on social indicators between India vis-a-vis Bangladesh, Nepal, and Vietnam. The most comparable in terms of the per capita income in PPP terms is Vietnam, which is way, way, way ahead of us. And I think it's really shameful to see that on a like-for-like comparison where we stand with what should be a peer in terms of income. But also when you compare ourselves with Nepal, a country going through tremendous amount of churn, they are ahead on every index except one mentioned there where they're equal to us, not lower. And of course Bangladesh, I see of course because not surprising to many of us who are familiar, despite again its many problems and despite being at one stage called a basket case, is also very substantially ahead of us. And I think this must worry us because it's not a question of comparing ourselves with developed country indices and saying we want to get there. It's looking at peers, at countries like us, countries which all of them went through a lot of turmoil, Bangladesh and Vietnam in particular, in terms of the stages of growth, and yet countries which have no higher incomes than us. We are not comparing with South Korea or even with China, which is many times of per capita income today, but with countries that are like us. And you wonder what's gone wrong. And I think that's very broad is the sort of context in which we worry about inequalities, not just in income, not just in distribution of wealth, but very, very importantly in the social indicators and where they show what we have done and what somehow in our model of development seems to be highly flawed, something that we need to look at. This consciousness has been there, but somehow what we've been able to do is minimal. And the recent correctives vis-a-vis the business sector in particular were initiated in many ways by pressure from civil society and started by the government. And like everything else in this country, the government wants to make laws which are very well intentioned, but most of our laws are normative. I mean, when you have traffic signals on the road, red means stop, and that's normative. You don't really have to stop, you can go through, but that's normative. It's like our laws on dowry, like our laws on gender equality, like our laws on domestic violence. So you have a law which SEBI has put in place, which again is a normative law. It's very good. Again, as I said, the intentions are excellent. It's a start. You might want more, but it's normative. You can see even that the 100 top companies, with all the resources at their command, with separate CSR departments, sometimes manned by literally, and some of you would be familiar with this, hundreds of people, are not even complying with that tick in the box, saying we have done this, 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 as is required by the law. Not that the tick in box means much, because very often you put a tick in the box very cleverly, and you have these hundreds of people sometimes to be able to work around that and say, yes, I'm doing this, and yet not do it. But that's a different story. Even the well-intentioned ones are not all there. And it's been some years now since the BRR has been in place. And keep in mind again, this is the 100 biggest companies in the country with unlimited amount of resources, all of whom make huge profits. Some of whom indeed put a lot of money into what you might call CSR or what they call CSR. The biggest company in this country, for example, is way above the CSR, formal CSR requirement. It puts as much as 50% more, 3% of its profits into what they have defined as CSR. Now, how much impact, what impact is something else. But the fact that they put almost 700 crores every year is in their records, in their annual reports. So correctives, business responsibility report, a very good one, started by SEBI, mandatory, it's not voluntary. There was the National Voluntary Guidelines, another effort to try and say, let's work together. This was part of the working together. This is not mandatory, it's national, it's voluntary, so see what you can do. And if you go and talk to our friends in the chambers of commerce, they will privately bemoan that very, very few companies have formally signed on as willing to do this. And if you look more broadly at the international context again and look at GRI, the Global Reporting Index, it's slightly more difficult, it's there. But when I last saw it, there were just a very low number of two-digit number. In fact, at one stage, it was less than a dozen Indian companies that had signed on to that. I think all this is indicative of the fact that either compliance is not easy to do or that companies are wary of doing this. And so the CSR again came in as a law with 2%. Again, very well intentioned, directional. The hope is that this is not big money into development, but that the corporates with their ability, their resources, their managerial skills will come up with new and innovative things. Not going to affect large numbers, but something innovative which could be taken forward in a different way, and something that helps the local community around which they work. Let's see how it works. It's at early stages, so I'm not cynical. I think something can happen. There are some very good companies doing very good work, and hopefully they'll act as beacons for others, and indeed for larger government programs which can then take this off. But I think a point very, very effectively and strongly made, I think it was Mr. Thomas who mentioned that, Mr. Pandey, this cannot and should not be a way for the government to renege on its commitments. The government is supposed to provide basic needs, and they are supposed to look after things which are part of what you might call the social safety net. And it can't be that they step away from this because they have now mandated a law or because the private sector is doing something. It can only be and should be additional, different, directional, and not a substitute for what the government should be doing as something which people in this country need. So that's just a point on the correctives that are being put in place and what they might do. But most importantly, going back again to what we might want to do on the correctives, and this has been mentioned time and again, so it's obvious that it's true, that it's a fact. It's not what you do with the 2%. That's what I call the Tirupati Handi syndrome. You commit all the sins you can and then go and put something in at Tirupati or wherever it's your favorite place and pray and you'll be absolved and go to heaven. So it is what you do when you're making the profit that's critical, how you run your company. And ultimately then maybe what you do with the profits. But the more important part, the bigger part, the more impactful part is how you run a company. And I think that's part of what the business responsibility report was supposed to do. The CSR is only an add-on, it's small. Hopefully it will be something good, but I think it's very small. And my suggestion is that while we need to look at that, see that it's used well, it's 10 to 15,000 crores probably, and we should see that it's well used. But I think the far more important part is that the very, very large impact of what business as a whole does, both private sector and public sector, not just with its employees, not with its immediate stakeholders, but the impact it has on the broader issues of environment, what signals it sends out, how it recruits people, what young people growing up today want to be aspired to be doing, and what role models there are for them. I think these are important factors as part of that. And it's in this context that I'm very, very pleased about what is being attempted now. It's a further step to the business responsibility report, and organizations here, particularly the Corporate Responsibility Watch, has been tracking it very usefully in doing things. The principle there has been more in terms of reporting on the basis that sunshine is the best disinfectant. You expose something and hopefully action will follow. But in many ways, this is a step forward in that direction, the index itself. And I'm hopeful that the index will bring out much more things. I'm very pleased at what was last mentioned, that there is data available so that a whole host of other researchers, whether it's civil society organizations or academics in universities, can now use this data to do more analysis, more cross-tallying, look at what is happening. hopefully some amount of primary data coming from civil society organizations and others that say that while the company says it's doing all this, and while they're reporting and telling us this, what's actually happening on the ground? Is there an impact? What is happening to their employees, their contract labor, their subcontractors? How are they treating their people or their indirectly employed people? The subterfuge is very clear nowadays. You don't do it yourself. You appoint a contractor or a consultant who does it for you. And your hands are clean. Somebody else dirties their hands on your behalf. That shouldn't be allowed to happen. I think the kind of exposures that we can do to look at that would be important. But finally, the ultimate step in the correctives, I think, has to be that how do we bring about something which the companies need to do because they have to do it. And this is a difficult one. I think ethically maybe or philosophically you can argue for or against. But ultimately in a practical, pragmatic, real world, there's nothing more effective than getting companies to do what you want them to do because they are forced to do so. Not by law, because law can always be bypassed. But if consumers or investors in the companies begin to act on them, begin to influence them, there's nothing else that the company is more fearful of. If consumers boycott you, you're dead. You're dead meat. It doesn't matter whether you've broken a law in the government or not and go into a court case that lasts for 20 years or pay a fine and get away with it. If the consumer deserts you, you're just finished. You close down. If your investors desert you, you're finished. And I think companies learn this lesson very fast. Look at the most recent example, and I'm not taking an Indian example intentionally. Look at what's happened to Volkswagen. They cheated, and that's now exposed. Their share value dropped by 1/3 in a matter of a few weeks. They lost 26 billion euros on the share market in terms of valuation. They had to make a provision of 6.7 billion euros for possible damages of what happened, and all analysts say that's an underestimate. It's going to be much worse. So there is the legal part, which is 6, 7, 8, 10 billion, and then there's the market reaction where they knocked off 26 billion euros from their standing. Now you can imagine the company going to react to that. They certainly are. It's not breaking a law and going to court and then fighting, no, this happened, that didn't happen, we were right, somebody else was wrong. It's an actual, immediate, instantaneous impact to which the company reacts. And I would urge us to think that as we use the Business Responsibility Index as a powerful tool to show who's doing what, how can we get others, even as we partner with the government and industry, how can we partner with investors and consumers? How can we bring greater awareness there to use them as pressure groups to really get the companies to do the right thing? And to me, that's very important, because while we continue to work with business jointly in their own interest, in the self-interest of the country, in terms of peer competition to say, I'm better because I'm more ethical than my competitor. But ultimately what's going to work is, can you also take that to consumers and investors, to which companies react? And I think that's a part of what we need to do. And that's in many ways a part of the engagement with business. After all, at least the investors are part of the business community. And I think that's something which we might want to look at as the next step. The Business Responsibility Index will be, somebody mentioned watchdog, yes, but I don't think it's a watchdog, because it can bark but it can't bite. And if you want to get that bite into place, it has to be through other means. The bark is critical. There has to be a warning, there has to be a sensor, there has to be a fire alarm that tells you something is going wrong. But if you need to put out the fire, you need to do something more than that. And that, frankly, what we can do best as civil society organizations, and I address myself to civil society groups here, is to push hard ourselves, but to get partners. And partners from both the business community, which are the big investors, or the small investor, the retail investor, but the big investors in particular, but also the consumers. And to the extent we can begin to see how to work on this, and to the extent we can work with industry itself and with government to do that, I think we will be very effective, because then our bark will be supplemented with a true bite, and you will begin to see change in businesses. And businesses, again, I stress, are our partners. Those who are ethical, those who are willing to do this, will welcome this, because it differentiates them from those who cheat. I hear good businessmen today, and there are many of them, who continue to tell me, look, I do business ethically, but I lose out a lot of business, and I'm willing to live with it, but I don't know how long. Because the guy who pays the bribe, the guy who pays off the inspector, the guy who cuts corners, has it easier, and he doesn't get caught. And if he does get caught, he gets away with it. I don't. How can we help these people? So it is a cooperation with business. I'm not suggesting a confrontation. I'm suggesting we cooperate, but we cooperate with ethical businessmen who want to do business in a proper way, with companies that are doing business properly, who would find this approach as useful to them because it sets them apart from competition which competes unfairly. Just a few thoughts on that, and my congratulations to the team. I went through the report as much as I could last night and saw the brief presentation today. I think it's a great effort, so my congratulations to all the teams that worked on it and those who conceived of this. I'm sure we will take it forward as we move on over time, but this is a fantastic start. It's a great way to begin to put into place what we begin to need to see, which is first exposure and then a joint work between government, business and civil society. Thank you.